Seasons of Maple Ridge. Chapters 12 to 16. By the time the storm passed, the morning sky had cleared to a cold, washed-out blue. The streets of Maple Ridge were littered with branches, puddles glinting like mirrors in the early light. Betty had just put on a fresh pot of coffee when she heard the sirens. A sound that was rare in a town like this, urgent, rising, echoing down the quiet roads. She stepped out onto the porch and saw a column of smoke curling above the rooftops, somewhere near Elm Street, just 3 blocks away. Without thinking, she slipped into her coat, grabbed her keys, and headed out. When she arrived, neighbors had already gathered in small knots, eyes wide with worry. A small, 2-story home, the Jenkins house, was on fire. Flames licked from the back windows, smoke pouring from the roof. The fire department had arrived quickly and was already at work containing it. Betty spotted Marla Jenkins and her teenage grandson Luke standing on the curb, shivering under a borrowed blanket. She rushed to Marla's side. "Oh, Marla!" Marla turned, her eyes red from smoke and tears. "We're okay," she said hoarsely. "Thank God. We lost the kitchen and most of the second floor. But we got out. Luke smelled the smoke and woke me up." Betty looked over at Luke, who, despite the chaos, stood tall and quiet, arms crossed and eyes on the firefighters. "You saved your grandmother's life," Betty said, placing a hand on his shoulder. He gave a shy nod, his cheeks pink from the cold. By afternoon, the fire was out, but the damage was clear. Word spread quickly, as it always did in Maple Ridge. But so did the response. The community sprang into action. Blankets, hot meals, a place to stay. Offers poured in from every direction. Eleanor from the library opened the community hall for temporary shelter. Ray brought over a generator and extra firewood. Betty, without hesitation, cooked a big pot of stew and dropped it off with loaves of fresh bread. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, Betty stood on her porch, watching the town come together like it always had. A tragedy had struck, but no one had to face it alone. Maple Ridge didn't forget its people. And neither did Betty. That night, with the firelight still dancing in her memory, she picked up her pen and began writing. Not just to James, but to the town itself. To the resilience, to the kindness, to the quiet bravery of people like Luke. And she realized that this wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to all of them. The day after the fire, with the town settling back into its gentle rhythm, Betty returned to her attic. Something had been nudging at her mind ever since she started reading James's letters. A sense that there was more to be found. More to understand. She dug through old boxes with care, each one marked in her mother's neat handwriting. Holiday decorations, school papers, James, 1962. That last one made her pause. She opened it slowly. Inside, beneath yellowed report cards and a faded baseball cap, was a leather-bound notebook, cracked at the spine and brittle at the edges. She hadn't seen it in decades. Her brother's journal. Betty sat cross-legged on the attic floor, dust motes spinning in the warm light streaming from the small attic window. She turned the pages, each one filled with James's unmistakable scrawl, neat but hurried, like he was always racing against time to get the words down. The first few entries were simple: football games, school dances, Saturday chores. But then, she hit October 1965. The tone changed. October 11th. Betty and I walked by the oak tree today. She kept humming that ridiculous tune from the radio, the one I can't stand. But I didn't tell her. I just let her hum. Her laugh is louder now, like she's trying to convince herself everything's fine. She's leaving soon. I know it. And I don't know what to say. October 13th. We fought. I told her she didn't understand what it's like to stay behind, to feel forgotten in your own hometown. She told me I was afraid of changing. Maybe she's right. But I think she's afraid of staying. I never said goodbye properly. I never told her that Maple Ridge wasn't the same without her. Betty's eyes welled up. She read on, through the months after she had left for college. James had stayed in town, helping their father with the family hardware store, fixing things quietly, living a life of quiet service. But through it all, he wrote about her. How proud he was, how much he missed her, how he regretted not making more of their time together. The last page was dated 1971, the year before his accident. I saw a robin on the porch this morning. Betty always said robins were good luck. I smiled. She was always right about little things like that. I wonder if she ever thinks of me when she hears that old song she used to hum. I hope so. Betty closed the journal and hugged it to her chest. Her heart ached, but not from sadness alone. There was comfort in knowing how deeply James had loved her, even if he hadn't always known how to say it. The past had always seemed like a locked door, but now the key had turned. And as she looked around the attic, at the boxes, the letters, the fading photographs, she knew she had something worth sharing. Not just memories, but a story. A week after the fire on Elm Street, the Maple Ridge Town Hall was packed. Word had gone out that the mayor and town council were calling an open forum to discuss emergency preparedness, and more broadly, the town's future. Betty hadn't planned on going. She'd never liked public meetings, too many voices talking over each other, too many opinions going nowhere. But something had changed in her over the past weeks. Something had shifted. She wanted to be part of things again. So, she brushed her hair into a neat bun, pulled on her warmest cardigan, and made her way to the old white clapboard building at the center of town. Inside, familiar faces filled the rows of folding chairs. Marla Jenkins and Luke sat together near the front, along with Ray from the diner and Eleanor from the library. Betty took a seat near the back, content to listen. Mayor Dalton, a stout man in his late 60s with a voice like gravel and a heart full of town pride, stood at the podium. "We're lucky," he began. "Lucky no one was hurt last week. But we've had 2 big storms this year, a weakened power grid, and a house fire that reminded us how vulnerable we can be." He looked out over the crowd. "We need to ask ourselves, what are we doing to protect this town? What are we doing to preserve what matters?" Betty felt a ripple of agreement in the room. Heads nodded. Murmurs passed from neighbor to neighbor. Then something unexpected happened. Marla stood up. "I'd like to say something," she said, her voice firm but kind. "We all helped my family last week. You brought blankets, food, kindness. But we can't always wait for trouble to come to lend a hand." She glanced toward Betty. "I think it's time we brought back the Maple Ridge neighborhood committees. We used to meet every month. Share resources. Check in on folks. Plan ahead." The room buzzed with interest. Eleanor rose next. "We've also got the Historical Society's old records just gathering dust at the library. Maybe it's time we start putting our stories together before they're forgotten." And then, all eyes turned as Betty slowly rose from her seat. She started, clearing her throat. "I didn't expect to speak tonight. But I've been reading old letters lately. Journals, too. My brother James wrote things down. Things I never knew. Things about this town. About staying. About leaving. About what matters." She took a breath. "We all have stories. And this town deserves to remember them. Not just for the past, but for the future. Maybe the answer to moving forward is looking back, together." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Mayor Dalton clapped. Others followed. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it didn't need to be. It was understanding. Respect. After the meeting, people came up to Betty, some she barely knew, others who remembered her from long ago. "You always had a way with words," Ray said. "I'd love to see those letters someday," Eleanor added. As she walked home that night under a sky full of stars, Betty felt something new. Purpose. Not just to remember the past, but to help shape what came next. It started with a cup of coffee. More precisely, it started with a cup of really bad coffee. Burnt, bitter, and definitely brewed from beans that had seen better decades. Betty had made it at home one foggy Thursday morning, as she tried to sort through a new box of letters from James. She grimaced after the first sip and muttered, "There has to be a better way." That afternoon, she wandered down to Pine and Bean, Maple Ridge's only real coffee shop, opened by a young couple, Jenna and Mark, who'd moved in from Asheville a year earlier. The place was cozy, with mismatched chairs, creaky floors, and walls lined with art made by local kids and retirees alike. Betty hadn't been inside since they opened. Something about the place had always felt too new, too not from here. But that day, something was different. Maybe it was the smell of cinnamon. Maybe it was the laughter coming from the back table. Or maybe Betty was just ready. She ordered a latte. Jenna, cheerful as ever, smiled and said, "With oat milk or regular?" "Regular," Betty said. "I'm old, not trendy." Jenna laughed. "You'd be surprised. Most of our regulars are trendier than we are." Betty sat near the window, sipping carefully. It was good. Really good. And then, on a whim, she pulled a letter from her purse. It was dated March 1970. James had written about the time they'd gone fishing at Lake Whitley, just the two of them, after their dad had taken sick. It wasn't a long letter, but it was full of detail. His favorite part was when she fell in, trying to quietly untangle a line. Betty chuckled aloud. A woman at the next table, a widow named Shirley she hadn't spoken to in years, leaned over. "What's so funny?" Betty hesitated, then handed her the letter. Shirley read it, smiled, and said, "You should share these." "I was thinking about it," Betty admitted. "Maybe a little reading group, or a storytelling circle. Or just a good old-fashioned coffee morning," Shirley said. "You bring the letters. We bring the memories." The next week, it happened. They called it Letters and Lattes, and every Wednesday at 10 a.m., a small group of retirees, neighbors, and even a few curious teens gathered at Pine and Bean. Betty would bring one of James's letters, or sometimes a journal entry, and read it aloud. Others would share their own stories. About the town. About loss. About love. About change. The group grew slowly. A few more chairs. A potluck table. Some people brought poems. One week, Luke Jenkins brought his guitar and played an old folk song Betty hadn't heard in 50 years. And for the first time in a long time, Betty felt like her brother was sitting beside her again. His words echoing not just in her attic, but through voices around her. The stories weren't just about the past anymore. They were shaping the present. Mill Creek Bridge had stood on the edge of town for over a century. Built from heavy timber and worn stone, it arched over the bubbling creek like a crooked spine, creaking under every truck and tractor that crossed it. Locals joked that the bridge had character. Outsiders just called it dangerous. When Betty was a girl, crossing Mill Creek Bridge was a rite of passage. She and James used to ride their bikes out there after school, daring each other to stop in the middle, lean over the railing, and drop acorns into the swirling waters below. But over the years, the bridge had seen less traffic. The new highway made it mostly irrelevant, and now its beams sagged and its stones shifted with every rain. Still, it held. Barely. That spring, a heavy storm brought flash floods, and a tree limb knocked out part of the bridge's siding. Rumors swirled that the county would tear it down and replace it with a concrete structure, efficient, safe, and thoroughly uninspired. Betty didn't know why it bothered her so much. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was James. Or maybe it was the idea that everything familiar was quietly being erased. She decided to visit. On a misty Tuesday morning, Betty put on her boots, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and walked the 2 miles out to Mill Creek. The road was quiet except for the distant chatter of birds and the soft hiss of the wind slipping through the trees. When she reached the bridge, she paused. It looked worse than she remembered, tilted at one end, a chunk of railing gone, moss growing thick along the stones. But it still stood. Brave. Defiant. Like an old man refusing to leave his rocking chair. Betty stepped onto the planks. They groaned under her weight, but she kept walking, one slow step at a time. Halfway across, she stopped, just like she used to as a girl. The water rushed beneath her, brown and quick. She pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket, a letter James had written just weeks before his death. She hadn't shared this one at Letters and Lattés. Not yet. It was too raw, too final. I think bridges are funny things, Bet. They're not places, really. They're not quite the beginning or the end. But you can't get where you're going without crossing them. You and I, we took different bridges. Yours led out into the world. Mine stayed here. And for a while, I resented that. But now I see it. Both bridges mattered. Both meant something. If you ever find yourself back at Mill Creek, stand there a while. Look both ways. And know that whichever direction you choose, I'll be with you. She clutched the paper, her fingers trembling. Then she sat. Right there on the edge of the bridge, legs dangling like she was 15 again, and let herself cry. Not from sadness, not entirely. But from the weight of memory. The ache of things unsaid. And the relief of being here. Eventually, she stood, brushed her hands off, and pulled out her phone. "Hi, Marla," she said when it connected. "Let's talk about saving the bridge." Thanks for listening, friends. This has been James, just sharing a piece of my heart with you. If this story reminded you of someone or something dear, go ahead and like, subscribe, and maybe share it with a friend who needs a moment of peace. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and take care of your memories.